Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History. As we look today at people who challenged the conformist culture of the 1950s. Indeed, in the 1950s, the Beatniks had rejected the conformity of materialistic middle-class suburban life. And in the 1960s, rejection of mainstream society continued, especially as a growing number of people came to question and even openly protest and oppose the government's policies in Vietnam. And this younger generation came to see a generation gap between themselves and their parents. Here we can see people with different ways of learning about the world, people of different generations with different styles of clothing. The younger people of the 1960s looked at their parents, sometimes known as the greatest generation, having survived the Depression and fought World War II. Or the silent generation, those who had grown up during World War II and been too young to fight it, as increasingly different from the children born late in the silent generation or in the baby boom. The culture of teenagers that developed, with teenagers who no longer had to work to support the family, but were able to work and buy clothes and music and other things they wanted for themselves, developed into a distinctive group who came to see the differences between themselves and their elders as a generation gap so great the two groups could not even possibly communicate, giving rise to the saying, never trust anyone over 30, unless I'm lying. And some people began to look at the culture around them. A culture based around mainstream churches, a culture based around a nuclear family, a man wearing a gray flannel suit, the perfect housewife with the perfect standardized chocolate cake in her perfect kitchen with all the modern conveniences, and not only question this culture, but want to reject it and replace this culture with something different, with a counterculture. A culture that valued youth, valued doing what felt good. They were sometimes referred to as hippies, from the word hip meaning to be aware of what's going on, a word dating at least to the early 20th century, and recycled more or less since then. They wanted peace and love and freedom. Many were opposed to the draft. Indeed, many of them were draft age, and so played a big role in the anti-war movement. Some experimented with drugs, some practiced free love. They listened to new types of music, wore different kinds of clothing. And not one of those people is wearing a gray flannel suit. Even their hair could be a countercultural statement. A woman wearing her hair simple and unstyled. A man wearing his hair long. Indeed, a man's long hair could be referred to as his freak flag, as these hippies were also referred to as freaks. Some, too, described them as flower children, peaceful and beautiful, and harmless. Although there were cases, too, of flowers being used in protest, not just in the U.S., but elsewhere. Protesters carrying flowers leading the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, which peacefully overthrew the military dictatorship there in the 1970s. And whilst some members of the counterculture turned away from traditional religious beliefs, many did seek some form of spiritual enlightenment, and often a rejection of materialism, often through Eastern religions such as Buddhism or variations of Hinduism. Others, though, remained Christian, but looked to the teachings of Christ that rejected mainstream materialism and rejected violence. There was a powerful Jesus People movement on many college campuses, although some who questioned these Jesus people and saw just their long hair referred to them as Jesus freaks. The Jesus people often organized youth groups, college Bible studies, played a big role in the creation of contemporary Christian music, and setting Christian themes to music that sounded like that played by their peers. All this is not entirely a new idea. The Salvation Army had begun by setting its musical traditions, by setting popular drinking songs of the day to religious lyrics. Some hippies set up communes, large houses or even small communities, sometimes in the countryside, sometimes in the city, where everything could be held communally. They could live together, share their interests, share their resources. Some people in the commune might make everyone's clothes. Others might cook. Others might grow food. Others might work more traditional jobs to support the commune as a whole with things that could only be bought with cash. Again, those living in the country often would, or at least would try, to grow most of their own food. Most of these were not very successful, although a few, such as the farm near Nashville, are still around today. In many cases, everything was shared in a commune, including the practice of free love. Free love is the idea that people should be able to have sex without being married and without being criticized for it. Sex, they said, was just one form of affection, something to be shared, not stigmatized. Although some feminists said that free love was just a plot to make women who said no feel guilty. And while certainly hippies did not invent being sluts any more than the flappers did, they certainly made free love something much more easily talked about, and in some cases practiced. Here we see a powerful countercultural poster supporting both free love of the girls who say yes and the anti-war movement, saying yes to boys who say no to the draft. And free love became much freer after the development of the birth control pill, first sold in the United States in 1961, which allowed a sexual revolution in America. Now, I don't want to speculate what the young couple there gets up to in their teepee, but I suspect they could be counted as members of the counterculture. We see there, too, a lady who's not dressed particularly counterculturally, and yet the sexual revolution may well have affected her, too. She seems to be dressed to go into the office, and this, too, was part of the sexual revolution. As birth control made it easier for women to choose when to have children, or if to have children, how many children to have. Women who wanted to pursue a career could do so much more easily. Careers for women having traditionally been interrupted by childbirth and child raising. And that had often been an excuse by employers to avoid hiring women or to pay them less when they did hire them. And for many hippies, drug use was also an important part of the culture. And here we can see several aspects of that. We can see there a man dressed in fairly traditional clothing in one corner, but his agriculture looks pretty countercultural. We can see on the other side the message to drop acid, not bombs, combining both drug use with an anti-war message. For many members of the counterculture, some drugs, such as marijuana and LSD, were thought to be more than just recreational, but to expand the consciousness, to allow new spiritual insights. Many hippies being very spiritual in their own way. One of the most famous proponents of the idea of drug use opening up one's mind to new insights was Dr. Timothy Leary, a researcher at Harvard University, who experimented with drugs himself and with his colleagues and with his students. He told Americans to tune in, turn on, and drop out. Policies not very popular with Harvard University, which eventually fired him. And for many young people in the 1960s and 1970s, music was their favorite medium of expression. The rock and roll of the 1950s, already controversial, developed in new ways in the 1960s. Here we see the Beatles in the early 1960s and in the later 1960s, as they had become more and more influenced by and influential in the counterculture. And several styles of music became more popular and changed as the 60s progressed. Folk music was primarily acoustic, while other forms of music that developed during the 1960s tended to favor electric instruments. Folk music of the 1960s was often a mixture of traditional folk music, of course, but also with more modern rock and roll and country influences, often having messages of peace and support of the environment. Bob Dylan and Joan Baez, pictured there, were amongst the most famous folk musicians. During the changes of the 1960s, protest songs became more popular. And protest songs were not a new idea. They'd been around as long as people both enjoyed singing and being mad about things, so probably since the beginning of time. Here we can see in the upper corner songs of the Wobblies. So, the labor movement's protest songs of the early 20th century. The civil rights movement used protest songs. We see there freedom riders singing "We Shall Overcome." But protest songs were also widely adopted by the anti-war movement. One example would be the song "Ohio," commemorating the Kent State Massacre in 1970. But if folk rock and folk music and protest songs were older styles adapted in the 1960s, a new style of music was known as psychedelic rock, developing primarily, although not only, in San Francisco from more traditional rock music, with even the Beatles and the Beach Boys recording psychedelic rock. But this was heavily influenced by the drug culture of many hippies. It tended to openly or in coded messages glorify drug use. All the coded messages were often not that deeply coded. Or it might create music that was simply wild, that seemed like it could have been inspired by drug use, or that might best be enjoyed while on drugs. And other things were repurposed in a similar way. The Disney film Fantasia enjoyed a rebirth of popularity in the late 1960s, and supposedly was something to see indeed while on acid. And hippies began to gather to share their ideas and everything else in the Summer of Love on the West Coast, particularly in San Francisco, in a neighborhood known as Haight-Ashbury. San Francisco being chosen because it was a freewheeling, permissive city that at the time was economically somewhat down on its luck, so that rent was often cheap, or the owners of buildings might not even bother to evict people simply squatting in them. But despite this, the city offered good health care and other public services, at least until the Summer of Love in 1967 overwhelmed many of these services. And people going to San Francisco to experiment with free love and drug use and all the other elements, good and bad, of the counterculture, sometimes suffered severely as they entered a place that was not as safe or as free as they had hoped, showing both the best and the worst of the counterculture. And the same, too, might be said of the music festival at Woodstock. Some people consider the Summer of Love in 1967 to be the peak of the counterculture. Others would say the 1969 festival known as Woodstock, meant to be held in Woodstock, New York, a place popular with many artists and musicians, including Bob Dylan, but eventually held over 40 miles away when local authorities decided they wouldn't be able to handle the crowds they anticipated. They expected to have at least 50,000 people come to the concert. In the end, at least 500,000 showed up, at least 10 times the number expected. And so the 3-day festival rapidly grew beyond its organizers' control, as music fans poured in, camped in the fields, openly used drugs, and explored free love. Soon they ran out of tickets and simply stopped selling them, allowing people in for free. The concert's clinics were overwhelmed with minor injuries, serious drug overdoses, and other issues too. And while there are no reliable reports of crimes during this time, there have always been rumors of many different kinds of activities, including assaults on women whose love did not end up being as free as they might have wanted. Still, it was in many ways a celebration of a culture of peace and love, Here we can see, for example, a young white woman and a young black man sharing a common water pipe, something that would have been illegal just a few years before in Alabama. And even if this was at times a dirty or unpleasant experience too, future festivals could not compare to the experience, both good and bad, of Woodstock, which very much captured the sensibility of the counterculture. But there was a backlash. The optimism of the hippies faded, particularly as many famous musicians died of drug or alcohol abuse. And as there was a backlash, a counterculture movement of, for example, the Hardhats, who attacked anti-war protesters, and generally growing conservative movement disgusted by the antics of the hippies. The booming economy of the early and mid-1960s, too, that had made all this experimentation relatively easy, also began to change as the economy fell on harder times in the late 60s, and especially the 1970s. Still, the quiet conformist suburbs had been changed forever, as many people began to desire new experiences outside this world many came to see as stifling. And many things were making change possible. Then the birth control pill had been available since 1961, making the delay or even avoidance of childbirth possible, at least in most places. However, Massachusetts and Connecticut still had laws banning the use of any contraceptives, bans that were challenged by an organization partly founded by Margaret Sanger, known as Planned Parenthood, which set up clinics in Connecticut to distribute birth control devices. When Connecticut tried to shut one of these clinics down, Connecticut was challenged, and in 1965, the Supreme Court ruled in the case of Griswold versus Connecticut that such laws were unconstitutional. The case of Griswold versus Connecticut discovering in the penumbra, in the shadows of the Bill of Rights, a right to privacy, and also considered marriage to have an ancient, built-in right to privacy. And so the court declared 7-2 that no state could ban the use of birth control, at least by married couples. And in 1972, access to birth control was guaranteed for all, married or not. And the right to privacy, established in Griswold versus Connecticut, was held to go much further in 1973 in the case of Roe versus Wade, which declared that abortion, at least in many cases, was a private decision between a woman and her doctor, thus striking down most bans on abortion around the country, which many people saw as a victory for women's right to control their own destinies, but others saw as simply the legalization of murder and moral opposition to the decision of Roe versus Wade contributed to the growing conservative movement in America, particularly the religious conservative movement. And laws such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had outlawed not just discrimination based on race, but also discrimination based on sex. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson signed an executive order requiring employers on federal contracts to take affirmative action to ensure that more women and more ethnic minorities were hired, arguing that centuries of discrimination meant that now extra assistance had to be offered to people who had been discriminated against systematically for centuries. And lawsuits against companies that did not follow the guidelines of affirmative action led to a growing number of women and minorities getting jobs they might not have before and getting better treatment in those jobs. Furthermore, in the 1960s, some women began to organize to demand full equality as a new wave of feminism swept across America. The women's movement of the early 20th century having become fairly quiet after achieving the right to vote, although a few activists had done their best to remain active in the intervening decades. One of the leaders of this new feminist movement was Betty Friedan, author of the Feminine Mystique, which had questioned whether women were really satisfied in the idealized role society said they should fill. Betty Friedan was a founding member of the National Organization for Women, or NOW, a feminist group dedicated to, in their words, take action to bring women into full participation in the mainstream of American society now, exercising all privileges and responsibilities thereof in truly equal partnership with men. NOW supported women's access to abortion and has repeatedly demanded, and sometimes gotten, federal legislation and funding to oppose domestic violence and protect rape victims. Another prominent feminist was Gloria Steinem, who began writing magazine articles about the mistreatment of women in the early 1960s. One of her most famous series of articles came when she got a job as a Playboy bunny at the New York Playboy Club, taking the job so she could describe what it was like. As you might imagine, Playboy bunnies did not enjoy the level of sexual equality or freedom from discrimination that one might hope. And to further promote women's issues, Gloria Steinem later founded the magazine Miss to promote feminist ideas. And while the abbreviation MS for Miss had occasionally been used specifically for Miss as an unmarried woman, it was now taking on a new political overtone, as an unmarried woman was traditionally referred to as Miss, a married woman as Mrs. In contrast, a married man is Mr., an unmarried man is also Mr. His marital status does not define his identity, but for a woman it traditionally did. Miss Magazine, however, argued that a woman's marital status should not matter. Gloria Steinem herself saying she never married because she could not breed in captivity. And while she did not invent the phrase, she did help to popularize the feminist slogan that a woman without a man is like a fish without a bicycle. And some feminists, including the members of NOW, wanted to do more to guarantee women's equality by enshrining it in the U.S. Constitution through an Equal Rights Amendment, which would state that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. This had originally been written by the suffrage campaigner Alice Paul, and had been introduced in Congress as long ago as 1921 and brought up every year since, but suppressed, typically not even being voted on one way or another, until Congress passed the Equal Rights Amendment in 1972, which pleased many women, but not all. For one thing, while women certainly had many legal and social restrictions, women did also receive some special protections under the law, which the Equal Rights Amendment would have done away with. Eleanor Roosevelt, for example, and most New Dealers had opposed the Equal Rights Amendment, feeling it was better to deal with specific women's issues one at a time through the power of the government. The League of Women's Voters had traditionally opposed it, as had women in the AFL-CIO. Furthermore, in 1972, the Vietnam War was still raging. And people who were increasingly uncomfortable with their sons being drafted to fight in Southeast Asia certainly did not want their daughters being drafted and sent to Southeast Asia. And if men and women were treated fully equally, women would presumably have to register for the selective service as well. Other protections for women included their ability to collect the Social Security of their husbands, even if their husband passed away or had earned more money during his career than they had. A man, however, married to a woman who had earned more than he was not eligible to receive her superior Social Security benefits. Others, too, simply challenged the ERA as challenging women's proper role in society, including a number of women. The most visible spokeswoman opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment was Phyllis Schlafly, a leader of the Stop ERA campaign, who spoke out against the Equal Rights Amendment as an attack on women and on traditional society. And although 5 more states did ratify the Equal Rights Amendment after she began her campaign against it, 5 states rescinded their ratification. The Constitution does not say you can take your ratification back, but also doesn't say that you can't. Among the states who ratified the Equal Rights Amendment, by the way, was the state of Tennessee. Among those who rescinded their ratification was the state of Tennessee. Whatever your view of the Equal Rights Amendment, Tennessee's right there with you. The Equal Rights Amendment also had a built-in deadline. It had to be ratified by March 22nd, 1979, and by that point only 35 states, including those who had taken back their ratifications, had voted to ratify it, leaving it 3 states short. So apparently it failed. But in 2017, 2018, 2020, 3 more states voted to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, bringing the total up to the necessary 35, at least if the ratification deadline and the choice of some states to rescind their ratifications are ignored, as some members of Congress have proposed doing. Still, things were clearly changing. During the first half of the 20th century, fewer than 20% of women worked outside the home. At the end of World War II, about 1/4 of women worked outside the home, most of them young women with no children of their own. By 1950, about 10% of women with young children were in the workforce. But by 1980, 60% of working-age women had a job, including, for the first time, over half of married women with children were working outside the home.